In 1974, the first tabletop role-playing game was created. Since then, people from all around have gathered to play. Join me as we talk with RPG enthusiasts while they share their best, worst, and favorite moments. This is You Had to Be There.
Hey everyone, welcome to You Had to Be There, a D&D storytelling podcast. If it's your first time joining us, my name's Tom DeSillis. I'm the host, and I have a really cool guest today. I know I kind of say that every time, and one day maybe I won't, but all my guests are cool. But my guest today is a Reverend, a tabletop role-playing game fanatic, a filmmaker, YouTuber, the works. Give it up, everybody, for Reverend Derek White.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely first Reverend on the show. So, congrats.
Hey, I like making history. I love making history.
Yeah, first Reverend. How long have you been a Reverend for? What's the Reverend timeline?
Whew. Well, I have been in ministry on and off since 1992.
All right.
So I would say 30 years. But I've been ordained with, I've ministered in a variety of denominations, but I've been ordained with the United Methodist Church. Well, I'll say I've been ministering with the United Methodist Church since 2007, and our ordination process is a little long. So I've been ordained in the UMC since, 2015, 2014, something like that. It's just complicated because every denomination does things a little bit differently.
Right.
And in the previous denominations I was in, you could be a reverend just by being approved by a board of the local church. But in the United Methodist Church, they required you to go to seminary, which meant completing a master's degree that was over 80 credit hours. It's like getting another bachelor's degree.
Wow.
And then you have a 2 to 3 year provisional process. So getting ordained in the United Methodist Church can take anywhere from 6 to 7 years.
Wow. Wow, that's wild.
It is wild. And I ministered the whole time I was in seminary, so I was pastoring churches and things.
Right. Very cool. So, and then as far as, because you're such a unique combination of things. So then you have been a Reverend for so long, but you mentioned, we were kind of talking about a little before, how long you've been playing tabletop games. You said since the 80s?
I started playing Dungeons and Dragons in 1983. 1983 was when I started playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I played throughout most of my teens, got away from it about the time I went into college for a little bit, but still had my books, still kind of wanted to play. And then I went through kind of my own purging of my books, my own personal little Satanic Panic, if you will, and got rid of my books for a short time. And then got back into D&D around 1995 or 96, and haven't looked back since.
Haven't looked back. I want to get into a lot of that. Before we get in, because I really want to kind of go in, because Satanic Panic is it's kind of like the awareness of it has kind of made such a comeback of for people like me, and I kind of want to explain what that was like, but if you want to just give a brief overview on kind of what you do as far as this combination of being a geek, you're known as the geek pastor. So if you want, for the people who have never heard about you, what's your elevator pitch about yourself?
Well, I'm known as the geek preacher on a variety of social media. And that came about back in 2008. In 2007, I was on a panel on faith and gaming at Gen Con, one of the largest gaming conventions in the U.S. And I was at that panel with Gary Gygax, the co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons. And Gary and I had talked online. We had chatted online on various message boards for about a year or two before that, and had a good friendship. And I got to meet with him face to face before the panel. We got to hang out, and we just hit it off wonderfully. Found out we had a lot of things in common. Gary, most people don't know, Gary was a person of faith, deeply religious person. Read his Bible every day, and he invited me to come and play a game with him. I mean, come on! I was invited to play a game.
I would take a time machine. Yeah, most people would take a time machine to go play a game of D&D with Gary Gygax. So.
Yeah, and unfortunately, due to my scheduling, I was in seminary, I was in ministry. No, I hadn't even started seminary yet, but I was pastoring. And I was actually, as an adult, finishing up my bachelor's degree. And it was right after the holidays, and preachers are really busy around Christmas. And my anniversary also falls during that time. So I couldn't go play D&D with Gary. And he passed away a few months later. He passed away in March of 2008. And it just broke my heart because I missed that opportunity. And he just was really such a nice and friendly person at that point in his life.
Right.
And he really just wanted to hang out with gamers. And I realized at that point that gamers need preachers too. They need pastors too. And funny story about that. You mentioned Geek Pastor. I go by Geek Preacher because back in 2008, I almost went with Geek Pastor to buy that domain online, but somebody else already owned it. And in the South, preacher and pastor are often synonymous.
Got it.
They refer to they don't ever call us Reverend. It's like, hey, preacher, how y'all doing today?
Right.
So they never even bothered to learn your name. You're just preacher or the preacher. And so I said, well, Geek Preacher is a good term for me. And the very next year at Gen Con for a number of years, a friend of mine, Dave Mattingly, had been doing an ecumenical worship service on Sundays. What that meant was people of all kinds of different denominations would gather together for a short worship service on Sunday at Gen Con. Because, hey, man, you're at a gaming convention. You want to go to church, but you don't want to go off site because you're going to miss the dealer hall before it closes. You're going to miss whatever's the games you're scheduled to play in on Sunday. So Dave had been putting those on for years, and he invited me in the fall of 2008 to do the worship service at Gen Con. And that's kind of how all of that started. I started doing the worship service at Gen Con. I got invited to other gaming conventions to do worship services. And the next year, after Gary had passed away in 2009, his son Luke started a mini convention in Lake Geneva called Gary Con, which you probably heard about in Big Bang Theory and a lot of shows like that. Right. And I have some friends who are in the industry, and one of my friends in the industry lived close to Lake Geneva. He said, Derek, you've got to come up here, man. You can stay with me. You can ride with me, and we'll go to the convention every day. And he works for a gaming company. And I said, sure, I'll do that. And so I was the first person to sign up for the very first Gary Con 1. Outside of the family and all of those people like that. But I signed up, went up there, and I've been to every Gary Con since then. I would volunteer off to the side. I did some worship services at Gary Con. I did a wedding at Gary Con a number of years ago, things like that. And eventually Luke asked me if I would be the chaplain. Luke's a military guy, so he understands the need for chaplains. I tell people real life doesn't end when you go to a gaming convention.
Right.
And a lot of times you come to your gaming convention with baggage, you're going through a divorce, you're going through, you had a family member pass away, something like that. You want somebody to talk to about it over a beer. And so Luke made me the chaplain of Gary Con. And I know it was 2015, 2016, something like that. I can't even remember now at all. COVID has everything blurring together.
Yeah,
dates mean nothing anymore.
Most of the time.
Dates are only important when you're in 8th grade history and you have that really mean teacher.
Yeah.
But so I became the chaplain of the Gary Con Gaming Convention, and I've been doing that for a number of years. And I even have an ecclesiastical endorsement as a volunteer chaplain for my own denomination. So I'm considered a volunteer gaming chaplain.
Nice.
And so that's what I do. That's what I do. I've been on family leave. I was pastoring full time up until last year, but I took family leave so I could better take care of our son.
Sure.
He has autism. And so I could also work on other projects like documentaries and things of that nature. So hopefully that's not much of an elevator pitch. That's more like a mini sermon. But,
yeah, well, you know, we went a few floors, but that's okay.
Yeah, that's all right.
That's all. That's very interesting. Actually, quick question with your son. Does your son play D&D a lot? Do you feel, because I've heard a lot of people do charity, especially for people with autism, and they do tabletop gaming because it's very beneficial to social skills and a lot of tools. I don't know.
Yes. Yeah, it is. It is. Actually, I've done some training through a group that does that called Game to Grow, where they work with children on the spectrum as well as other children who may be dealing with anxiety or social issues. And so I've done some work in that area as well on how to use role-playing games as a way of overcoming certain social issues. And I have played with my son. He's played in just a general game with a large group of other people, but he seems to prefer when I do a game with me and him one-on-one. And cool. We've done that and gone over social issues. Like sometime one of the things we did in the game, for example, was whenever he came across a conflict, he would have his character run away. And I just kept putting the conflict back in front of him because I wanted him to deal with that. How do you handle conflict? And he didn't want to he didn't want to do it violently because for him it was a much more real experience than a video game.
Right.
So he actually, we ended up talking through it and working through that issue of how this role-playing game could help him interact with other people better. And it's worked well. My daughter, though, I have an adult daughter. She's in her 20s, and she plays D&D regularly with her friends. Right. So, yeah, I play D&D with both my kids.
That's wonderful. And I love that story and how positive, an experience that can be, which kind of leads us back. Like, I find it so fascinating when you talk about, like, Gary and how he was a religious person and, what's been going on. Just for a brief introduction, like, I've only been playing D&D for like 2 years, but what happened was I started playing in the pandemic and I was like, this game's amazing. And I was so upset at myself. I was like, I knew I wanted to play years ago and I'm kicking myself. So the half of this show is just me trying to cram in 30 years of D&D that I didn't get to do. But then upon my research, I find out about Satanic Panic and I'm like,
yeah,
what? This is a thing? This happened? This is one, that's ridiculous. Most of the time you're trying to defeat the devil anyway, 9 times out of 10. You could be a cleric. You can literally be, like all these things. And then I find out about things like the West Memphis 3 and all of these like horrible. And then I find out more information that they've kind of come shed some light and they won't test the DNA and just all these things that put this immense burning fire in my stomach that makes me kind of angry at how, like, because when I grew up, I always gravitated towards the freaks, the weirdos. Like I was a child, growing up on the block with the kids. I had a group of friends, and then upon entering middle school, I went to sit with those friends that were into sports and stuff. And then I look behind me and I see the table of the nerds, and I left those friends. I was like, I like these people better, and like it really bothers me on how much like pain that it has caused just from really no fact or anything. So what was it like to play D&D and then get into religion? Like,
now that's a great question. I haven't quite had it asked to me that way because I did not grow up in a very religious household.
Right.
By the time I came along, my family had stopped going to church. I mean, my mother and my stepdad, they weren't even married at the time. So one, you're not going to be going to church in the 1970s, unmarried couple. You know what I mean?
Right.
And a divorced woman with 4 kids. Oh, heaven forbid you go to church. But they also ran a nightclub. Even the most liberal progressive church in the 1970s would look at that negatively. So I didn't grow up in the church. I grew up culturally Christian. You know, somebody
Right.
asked us what our religion would be. It would be Christian. And we were in a certain part of the South. By default, that means Southern Baptist.
Right.
And but the only religion I got was from watching a Charlie Brown Christmas special growing up. Maybe reading. I read more mythology than I read the Bible. I was reading Bullfinch's mythology when I was 10 years old, and then I read Deities and Demigods when I was 12 or 13. So in the documentary, one of the things that we talk about is how my mom didn't have any problems with me playing D&D. But when I came to faith and got into the church, which for me, people say, why did you get into the church? I had done some things I didn't like about myself. There were things I did not like about myself. And one of the things that the church did for me was it offered me forgiveness. And I came into a tradition that said, hey, you know what? Forgiveness is good for you. It's good for your soul. So you need to forgive yourself. You need to forgive others. But you also need to make it right with those people you've wronged. We don't hear a lot about that third one.
Yeah, that's the hardest part.
Yeah. And so I started doing those things. I started trying to make things right with people like that. But I also came into a very conservative religious tradition. And so I'd remembered all those things I'd heard, even though my mom had gone through my books and said it was all okay. You know, because of that conservative religious tradition I was in, I went out and I got rid of all my books. But the geeky side of me took over because I was still a geek.
Right.
And so I realized, you know what? I don't know a lot about the Bible. I know I want to go into ministry. I was already ministering. I was already becoming a youth pastor and doing these other things in the life of the church. I was working with college ministry, all kinds of things like that. And I said to myself, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't have the background or the education that I need. So I went to a Bible college, and actually a Christian university in East Texas. And while I was there, I rediscovered C.S. Lewis and I rediscovered J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, as a kid, I did not know that either one of them were both very devout Christians. C.S. Lewis was a former atheist, devout Anglican. J.R.R. Tolkien was a lifelong Roman Catholic. And when I began to discover that, I began to question those things, you know, and I began to look and I began to find out that all of these people that were people of faith had very vivid imaginations and loved fantasy. And this would have been back in the mid 1990s. And later on, a number of years ago, the first documentary I took part in was called The Fantasy Makers, and it was on the lives of 3 Christian men, George MacDonald, C.S. Lewis, and J.R.R. Tolkien. And you know, this is something, and we delve into this in our recent documentary, we delve into this a lot, is how since the 1970s, I would say since the 70s, maybe even the 1960s, especially in America, people of faith and Christians have been told to turn off their imagination. We've been told that our imaginations are evil, that our imaginations are wicked. But when you look at these writers like Tolkien, Lewis, even people like Madeleine L'Engle, George MacDonald, these are all devout people of faith who lived a life of imagination. And that's part of what faith is all about. faith is about imagination. You're believing in something you can't see, taste, touch, or smell. And if we believe in a divine being, why aren't we being creative? Why aren't we just creating beautiful art, beautiful literature?
It's kind of like what they always say, how like some people believe in God, some people don't, but there's like that kind of faith that everyone, whether you believe it's a deity or not, that's in your heart. But that's where the creativity comes from too, your heart.
Exactly.
And like it all comes from that same part and expression. We have one, D. Mattingly, I do see you in the chat. Thanks for joining us. You dropped some stuff about Satanic. He said, much like C.S. Lewis, I was dragged kicking and screaming into the kingdom of God. So I don't know if that's a common phrase you've heard about, but...
Well, I actually know who that person is. That's Dave Mattingly. And Dave is the guy who asked me to do the first worship service at GenCon.
What's up, Dave? Thanks for setting that up. Wouldn't be here without you. Awesome.
Yeah, and that's part of Dave's own story. He got dragged kicking and screaming into the kingdom of God.
Right.
Whereas for me, I came in going, whoa, wait, somebody's willing to forgive me for being an asshole? Okay, let's talk about this.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I was pretty standard of the American Christian, Catholic streamlined process. I got my communion, I got my confirmation, and then we went on holidays only, and then we stopped. And that's pretty much once I had to start working.
And that is so similar to the way I grew up.
Yeah.
Which was funny. I tell people, they're like, oh, were you they call them the CME Christians, Christmas, Mother's Day, and Easter.
Okay.
And I said, no, we weren't like that. We were Easter only because Christmas is the holidays. What's that got to do with Jesus? This is Santa Claus. It's too busy. You got trees, you got Christmas parties, you got all this. Mother's Day, my mom didn't want to go to church on Mother's Day.
Yeah, Mom wants breakfast in bed. She doesn't want to go to church.
Damn right. And in fact, a lot of times my parents were running a nightclub. So it was Mother's Day. They're out late on a Saturday night. So they're sleeping in. So when we did go to church, it was Easter. So all I ever got was and I was like, why are we going to church, man? I want my eggs. I want my,
So why don't we talk, because we're, you talk about this like war on imagination, which your film that is out in Canada only right now, but hopefully soon in the US.
Yes, you can actually, if you're on Amazon Prime, you can look for it now. It's called The Satanic Panic and the Religious Battle for the Imagination. And it will pop up on American Amazon Prime, and you can put it on a watch list. So I'm hoping they will release it on Amazon Prime in the US.
Beautiful. I'll do that.
Yes.
So what was like the main driving force behind that? Because that's like your most, I know you said you've done a couple other projects, but that's like your most recent big project.
Yeah. Well, the driving force for me, the nice thing I discovered about making this was the first one I'd ever really had this much input into. The first two documentaries I was in were all, what the director had in mind. And they just interviewed me as a subject on it. They wanted me to be the common everyday preacher talking about these things, and which was fun and was wonderful. But what had been driving me, and I'd been talking to Andrew Wall, our director, I'd been talking to him for a few years about doing this documentary. And my driving force was because I knew so many people in the industry that were people of faith.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I knew Gary Gygax. I had gotten to know the guy who started Dragon magazine back when it was called The Dragon, Tim Kask. Tim is a person of faith. Steve Sullivan did a lot of cartography for the early Dungeons and Dragons adventures. And Steve is very active in his church. I have a friend, Jolly and Barbara Blackburn. They put out the Knights of the Dinner Table Gamer comic, and they've made the Hackmaster role-playing game, and they're people of faith. And so I wanted to do a documentary that was from their perspective. What was it like for you as a person of faith to work for this company that's being attacked by your fellow Christians?
Right. Yeah.
It morphed beyond that in many ways. It morphed into a lot of other things. We had Dr. Joseph Laycock in the documentary, who has written extensively on the Satanic Panic, or what he refers to as moral panics. The Satanic Panic is something that happened in the 1980s, but it is a subset of what we refer to as moral panics. Moral panics are things that go on, whether it's a moral panic about abortion. That's what our country is going through right now. That is a moral panic on both sides. And that is a perfect way to talk about it. You could call it the abortion panic, but it is a moral panic.
Right.
The Satanic Panic was a moral panic going on in the 80s. And so our documentary ended up morphing into these interviews with these people of faith who worked for the company and what that was like. We ended up talking a little bit about how the history of role-playing games and how Dungeons and Dragons came about. We touched on that briefly. We touched on these moral entrepreneurs like Pat Robertson and Jack Chick, who were coming out against D&D in the 80s and 90s and even today. And so it really morphed into about an hour and a half long documentary that covers a wide path of what went on in the 80s, but also touches on how that extends into what we're dealing with in our country to this day.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, that mass panic, and it can be as, driven in so many different ways. It's almost like, it was kind of almost like like a witch hunt. It's like in that situation. And
it is. Well, that's what Gary Gygax referred to when 60 Minutes did their hit piece on D&D back in the 1980s. Gary Gygax referred to it as a witch hunt.
Right.
That's exactly what it is. And one of the things that really kind of astounded me is that when I talked with Dr. Laycock, one of the things we talked about, we got a little of it on camera, but we talked about this, some of it had to hit the editing room floor, but it's how those moral panics, like the Satanic Panic, are still going on in the forms of these groups that we have today.
Right.
For example, you may remember a few years back when they said that Hillary Clinton was running a sex cult underneath a pizza joint.
Right. Yeah.
That is the same thing. All these conspiracy theories that QAnon throws out.
Right.
That's what the Satanic Panic was, because during the 80s, one of the things, we could have done maybe 2 or 3 documentaries on this. Another thing that was going on in the 80s, besides the Satanic Panic, the Satanic Panic is an umbrella term that we use to refer to just Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
But I believe, from my looking at it, there was an overall panic about a lot of things, because there were accusations of satanic ritual abuse.
Right.
At child care facilities in the 1980s. And they were all proven to be a hoax. But this is a conspiracy theory that's going on. Now, don't get me wrong. There was child abuse going on. Right. In some of these places. But they were saying that this was an orchestrated attack on our children by satanic cults around the country.
Right.
And that mindset still pervades our culture. And unfortunately, for me as a pastor, what this does is, when we say it's this nefarious, nebulous organization out here doing it, then what we have to do to stop this abuse is to find the leaders of this secret cabal. Does this sound like a D&D game to you?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Let's find the
like
leaders
leaning
of
in
this.
too. I'm like, oh.
Yeah, let's find the leaders of this secret cabal. And when we find the leaders of this secret cabal and we take them out by rioting on Capitol Hill on January 6th. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. by doing these things, if we can find the leaders of the secret cabal and we can take them down, then we'll stop the abuse of our children, or we'll stop the abuse of our country.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, you know what, these people over here have mental health issues and we need to work on mental health in our country.
Yeah.
Oh, wait. We need to actually believe the children and believe the women when they come out and they say they've been abused, like they were doing in the Me Too movement.
Right.
We need to actually believe the victims instead of believing the perpetrators. If we actually did that instead of focusing on some secret cabal, we might help these people.
Yeah.
And make people take individual responsibility for their actions.
Yeah, and especially with a lot of these situations when the evidence is completely like anecdote, like there's no hard evidence at all to prove anything like that, you know, just because there's a lot of, you know, you could take musicians, for example, there's you know, tons of famous musicians out there, and sometimes you hear about ones that do really great things, and other times you hear about ones that do really bad things, and, you know, they are still made a great creative thing, but just because, I don't know, there's so many people that play these games and do great things, and then just because someone does something bad and they also played games doesn't mean that they would have changed anything. And I don't know, I remember the one scene that always when I watched the West Memphis 3 documentary is that guy who like claimed to be a cult expert that ended up not even being legally available to do anything. He held up like one of Damien's books and he was just like, this is all the evidence I need. And I almost jumped through my screen back in time to be like, how dare you? Right? How dare you use that as evidence? That is not evidence. That is a book. And it was like, so yeah, it's wild on how that all over the place.
Was a tactic they were doing in the 1980s.
Yeah.
That so-called Dr. Thomas Radecki did that in the 1980s with the Satanic Panic. Just by saying, you know, the claims are unsubstantiated.
Right.
But that's part of our problem with humanity. We don't mind unsubstantiated claims. Right. And one of the things that we found out that I really found out, and this hit me hard on a personal note, is how when these narratives seep into our culture, even when facts prove them to be wrong, these narratives are still accepted by the broader culture. So let me give you an example. One of the things in the documentary, they do a recreation of my mom going through my Dungeons and Dragons books and saying, I don't see anything wrong with this. This is okay, right?
Right.
And then I burnt my books in the early 90s because for some reason it was stuck in the back of my head that it was wrong. I didn't tell my mom about that. My mom already thought it was weird enough that her son was becoming a clergy person. You know, my mom thought that was strange. That wasn't something people in our family did. And then a few years later, when I got back into Dungeons and Dragons as a minister in a conservative denomination at that time, I called my mom up. My mom said, hey, what's going on? And I said, well, you know, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And I was just playing some D&D with some friends. And my mother, who this may have been 13 years before, had gone through my books and said, I see nothing wrong with it. Her response to me was, isn't that evil demonic game? Now, that's because the cultural narrative had seeped into her brain.
Right.
And because of that cultural narrative, it invalidated the facts she had personally investigated.
Right.
And to me, that's really powerful in what we see going on the internet today.
Yeah.
We see kids radicalized and kids changed. Why were you changed? Why were you radicalized by these organizations? And that's because it becomes a cultural narrative that has seeped into their brain, even when it's not true and the facts have been totally unsubstantiated.
Yeah. Did she after further exploring this situation, because did she almost see the news that happened years after you started playing and then was like, oh my God, I must have missed something. My poor baby. I exposed them to this game that I thought was harmless. Or
I don't even think it was that.
Did she not even remember?
It was just, yeah, right. Because it's in the back of your head. And by that time, you know, it's it was assumed, because my mom, you know, her son's a minister, so my mom actually started going back to church herself. And it just becomes an assumed narrative within the Christian church that this is evil.
Right.
And this is why I have friends across the spectrum. You know, I have some Episcopalian friends who will tell me that was never a problem for us.
Right.
It was never a problem for us. And they said, man, we just laughed it off. And then I have other Episcopalian friends go, oh, yeah, man, we could never touch that stuff. And so
like that.
it depends.
Like it's a drug.
Yeah. It depended on the narrative, on the story in their particular community. But we live in a world today where stories aren't relegated to one small community over here or one small community over there. These stories go viral right away.
Was there ever, two questions? It was your denomination that you were with when you started playing again. Were they like, no way? And did you have to like hide your dice?
A fun story. No. When I came into ministry in the United Methodist Church. Okay. The same year, I was on a panel with Gary Gygax on faith and gaming, and I refused to not let my freak flag fly.
Amen, brother.
I said, and I have met other clergy who have hidden it.
Yeah,
other clergy in my own denomination who have hidden it. But when I went back into ministry, I said, I'm not going to hide anything about who I am. The fact that I like to drink a beer every now and then, you got a problem with it, I guess you don't need me. The fact that, I can sometimes be a little off color. I'm not being profane. I'm just being a little off color. If you can't deal with that, you can't deal with me. And, but most importantly, I am a geek. I have a Green Lantern tattoo on one arm, a dragon tattoo on the other arm. I love comic books. I love video games. I love Dungeons and Dragons. And if you can't deal with that, you can't deal with me. And so, I was just out and about in the United Methodist Church as a geek.
That's awesome.
Yeah, well, it was awesome and fun, but I got in trouble a few times.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, did you ever have any pushback from that? Also, in previous years, maybe even before you became, got more into religion, did you deal with any of that satanic panic where you pushed back at them and be like, you have no idea what you're talking about, like kind of situations?
It's weird how my journey went. When I was most of my 20s, I spent in a conservative denomination. And while I was getting back into D&D, I didn't mention that to people. But I would mention Tolkien and Lewis, and they were cool with that. So they were fine with that. There were a few times, like if I remember one time, and you touched on a little of this when we were talking before this.
Sure.
Or you may have said it on here, but it was funny. I remember being in a game store in Jackson, Mississippi, and I was still doing some sort of ministry, and it was still a fairly conservative denomination. So I tried to keep it a little hidden then, but I'm in a game store. Nobody knows who I am. And I'm buying a Dungeons and Dragons book. And this lady in front of me in line looks at me and she says, oh my goodness, isn't that game with demons and devils in it? And I said, yeah, and we kill them.
Yeah.
And she said, oh, that sounds cool.
Yeah.
She said, oh, that sounds cool. Yeah, we're going to kill the demons and devils.
That's what I've always been saying. I'm like, this makes no sense. Pretty much day one, they're like, you're taking out the cultists, okay? And the cultists are trying to bring back the devils, and you're going to stop them. And you're like, wow, this is great.
Exactly.
Every once in a while.
Just like your favorite TV show.
Exactly. And sure, every once in a while, some people will throw an evil campaign in there, and they'll be like, we're going to be the bad guys. But better you do it there in your imagination than in the real world, right?
One of the best interviews we had was with Merle Rasmussen. Merle Rasmussen worked for the company that made Dungeons & Dragons in the 1980s, and he made some modules for them.
Okay.
Adventures. He made some adventures for them. But they also got Merle to write a game he really wanted to write. And that was called Top Secret. And Top Secret was like a James Bond style role-playing game. And one of the very cool things that Merle Rasmussen said was, people complain about the fantasy elements in Dungeons and Dragons, but not one person ever complained about the violence in my game Top Secret, because his violence was real world violence. His violence was about assassinations and military coups and things like that. He said nobody had a problem with that.
Right.
Nobody had a problem with that at all. And that is very telling. That is very telling that see, I have more of a problem with real world violence in a game than I do with fantasy violence. And when I do violence in my games, sometimes it's cartoon style violence, you know. I don't want it to be horrifying or terrifying most of the time. No,
yeah.
I had to say that most of the time.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
sometimes I like it to be a little horrifying and terrifying because we like to be scared.
Right. No, I mean, some of my favorite, I've said it before, but like some of my favorite I don't like scary movies, but I'll play like a creepy, haunted tabletop campaign like any day. Like I love it because I don't know, I feel more immersed in it, I guess, and it's not like jump scary. It's just like this weird like situation. But yeah, I don't know. I kind of lost my train of thought, but with those, oh yeah, because I was saying like I do kind of agree where like, you know, I'll murder hobo my way through a dungeon crawl, but like if it was like more of a cop show, or if I was some guy with like a gun or a knife and I was supposed to like kill everyday people in like a bank, I would feel kind of weird about that. Like I would be like, this is kind of feels a little off. Like I don't know. So yeah. I understand that. For me, I feel like real world violence kind of does affect me more than imaginary violence.
And it should. It should. Real world violence should horrify us.
Yeah.
Real world violence should cause us, you know, when we see what's going on in Ukraine and places like that, that we should be horrified by that.
Right.
And when we're not horrified by real world violence, we need to wonder if we're losing our humanity.
And
because that's part of being human.
I think that, and that it raises a very good point that like the people that, you know, maybe had some connection with D&D or video games or things and did terrible things, they did terrible things in the real world, which means they had a much different disconnect, because we play these games to disconnect from the real world and enjoy a you know, fun imaginary situation, but then we have the ability to, you know, go back into the real world. And there can be, I guess some people might use the argument, be like, well, you know, then people who can't disassociate shouldn't play those games. But then there's all those, you know, there's anecdotal evidence about people with past history shouldn't smoke marijuana. And maybe there's some truth to that too. But it's about I feel like it's more about the education and the understanding. You know, if you take a child and you introduce them to D&D, it's your job to also explain to them, especially if they're very young, like, this is a game, this is imaginary, this is real world, there's a difference.
Well, one of the things that Dr. Laycock points out in the documentary that I really love is that the children of the 1980s were able to distinguish fantasy from reality so much better than the adults were. Because, you know, and this is something I refer to. I didn't say this in the documentary, but sometimes, sadly, some aspects of faith and religion, and I'm not talking about just Christianity here, I've taught world religion, but some aspects of faith and religion corrupt our imagination to the point where we can no longer distinguish fantasy from reality. You know, I've met people who have had mystical experiences, and it has been a beautiful and wonderful thing for them. I've had some in my own life, and they were beautiful and wonderful things, and they connected me to the real world better.
Right.
But I have seen people been giving these stories and these narratives that are corrupting within religious communities, and I've seen them do very, very horrible things. To their families, to their children, to their community. And this is one of the things, if you're a person of faith and you're watching this and you're hearing this, you know, I have to say, you know, where do you find things that restore your faith in the beauty of the world? to me, that is the essence of what faith is about. Is where are you finding beauty in the world? Are you finding hope in the world? Are you finding goodness in the world? And that's why when I run games, for the most part, yeah, I like to run an evil game every so often. I do like to do that. But for the most part, I want people to try and take on the roles of heroes, because in our real lives, we don't always get to be heroes. And if we can practice being a hero in a game, then maybe, just maybe, when we get that opportunity to go out into the real world and we see someone hurting or someone being abused, we'll take the steps to be that hero in their life.
Wow, I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little teary-eyed right now. That's beautiful. I love that so much. I'm a hippie that ended up being born in the 90s instead. I'm always like I I'm a heterosexual man, but I love Pride Month because it's all love, baby. It's like I'm like,
exactly.
Yeah, it's all love. Everybody's just having, want to be.
Here, I'll show you this on camera.
Themselves.
This is, if you love Pride Month.
Yeah.
This is my Pride D20
a little
pin.
To your left, I think you got to go. There we go.
Perfect. This is my Pride D20 pin.
Beautiful. Yeah.
For Pride Month.
Yeah. I dig it. I dig that, and I love that message you said, that like practicing being a good person definitely can help you be a good person. And I mean,
know where that idea comes from? It actually comes from your own religious tradition. You said you were raised Roman Catholic, right?
Correct. Yeah.
All right. Roman Catholic had this thing called virtue ethics, which many Protestants, of which I'm a part of that tradition, have ignored for the most part. And that's sad. And virtue ethics basically says, if you practice something, it will become a habit.
Right.
That sounds familiar to your Catholic upbringing. If you do something long enough, it becomes a habit.
Right.
And it becomes a part of who you are. Well, here are the virtues: fortitude, prudence, temperance, justice, and then faith, hope, and love are the three Christian virtues. If you practice love, you become loving.
Yeah.
If you practice fortitude, which is a form of courage, if you practice courage, you become courageous. And how many times have we seen films or read books where the hero or the heroine starts off cowardly and afraid, and they're thrown into these horrifying positions and time again, and they stop getting scared, and they finally get mad, and they get courageous, and they go out and they save the village, they save the town, or they save the world.
Yeah.
If we practice courage, we become courageous. If we practice love, we become loving.
I think there's real world practicality to that. And as someone who, I'm not a very confrontational person, and a few months back I had someone kind of harass one of my female friends, and usually I'm not confrontational, and I didn't physically attack Texas, but I made him 100% leave because I had enough. And I wonder how, like, almost there is the potential that practicing being a good guy in most of my games, kind of boosted that a little bit. There is that. It's entirely possible. I can say this, after a while of playing now, most of my characters a little more on the neutral, chaotic side. But I have been longing for a good justice-filled one shot of some sort to play a halfway decent character for a while.
One of the things that D&D can help us do is escape the real world.
Right.
But one of the things that good fantasy and good science fiction have always done, in my experience, they've also critiqued the real world. Mm-hmm. Science fiction does that. One of my favorite books of all time is Frank Herbert's Dune. Frank Herbert's Dune is a commentary on how the West has invaded the Middle East and tried to plunder it of its resources. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with Dune?
I know of it. Dune? I'm not. Okay. I'm more of a video game and kind of TV show.
Well, just a brief outline
game
of Dune
nerd.
I like card games too.
Yeah,
Dune is a desert world where there's very little water, and the Empire, if you will, the Emperor, mines the planet of Dune for the spice melange. So the whole empire relies on this one spice that they have to use. They need this spice because it's a hallucinogen that allows them to bend space to travel from planet to planet.
That's pretty cool.
So the empire is mining a desert world for resources to travel. Right. That is the West. That is a science fiction commentary on how the West mines the Middle East for oil to travel around the world. That's what that at its heart, that's what Frank Herbert is doing.
Right.
And he uses religion and religious elements in it to talk about this.
It's kind of like, so someone reading it would go, oh my God, can you believe this shit? Someone's doing this? And they're like, yeah, us. Yeah. And they
us.
Go, oh.
We are doing this.
Yeah.
we're working the world. Yeah. And now, we're the world to get the resources we need instead of trying to work in conjunction with the world. You see my neoliberal hippie self coming out here.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's, look, I try to stay as much in the middle as possible because I think that there are appropriate ideas that come from different people. I definitely do sway more on the hippie liberal side a little bit, but I try to listen and understand before I pass judgment on things.
So my point about Dune is that if one of the most popular science fiction books can make that sort of commentary on society, why can't we do that in our fantasy role-playing games?
Right.
And I've done that. I have used fantasy role-playing games to teach inclusion at a gaming convention. For example, I ran a game that one of the places they had to stop in was a drag bar. And one of the and all of my players in this game were adults. I put this as an 18-plus game. And I just wanted to see how this would work in this setting with a bunch of different people. And they stopped in the drag bar, and all my players were men. They didn't realize it was a drag bar. They had no idea.
They rolled low perception.
And so they started flirting. Yeah, they started flirting with one of the people in there. And I was amazed at this table because almost all of these players, except for two of them, were close to my age. These were guys in their 40s and 50s. And they all responded positively to that inclusive element I put into the game. And they were very good about it because I was worried. Because for me, I wanted to put the drag bar in there because it was part of the story. You know, one of the characters in the story. And the character had actually come from a book or something I'd read. And I said, oh, this is cool. I want to put this in here. And I didn't even think about what I was doing. But after it happened, I was like, wow, seeing all these older white guys sitting at a table. And they're really cool with the inclusion of this drag bar and this person dressed in drag in there. And that's how we can address, that's why I've learned representation matters. So when we make things like that normal in our gaming worlds, it makes it more normal in the real world too. Just like when we do it with television shows, you're a comedian, you know that representation matters on the stage. We need to see more female comedians of color, we need that representation because that is essential to connecting with the audience. Because when an audience can identify with you on the stage, they make that personal connection. They should teach that in preaching school.
Yeah, making personal connections. Yeah.
Yeah. When you can make a personal connection through a comedy show or a sermon, that's where people connect with you. That's probably why I didn't always do so great in local churches, because when I would get up and I would give them an illustration using Green Lantern, some of them just didn't get it.
That's funny. While we're kind of getting into your games, we're at about an hour, but I don't let anyone get out of here without some fun tabletop RPG stories. So you do you mostly run games, or do you get to play every once in a while?
I during the pandemic, I really got to play more. So I would say I tend to balance it out. Of
Nice.
late, whenever I'm at a convention, I rarely play in a game. I mostly run games. So the main games I run are Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition now, and Call of Cthulhu, which is a horror-based role-playing game. But I have a cartoonish streak in me, so I like to run Scooby-Doo Cthulhu, where everybody plays one of the characters in the Scooby Gang.
Oh,
And I even give out Scooby snacks at my games.
that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
What are the Scooby snacks?
So,
yeah.
they're just small graham crackers that look like dog biscuits.
Very cool. Oh, I love that. I've only really played like one other system, but I played 5th edition, and then obviously I play 5th edition regularly, and then I've played Call of Cthulhu once and I loved it. And I'm still, I know if you're listening to this live, the episodes of the Call of Cthulhu one shot that we did on the stream will be released very soon, I promise. But yeah, that's cool. So those are the ones you mostly like to run?
Yeah, those are what I mostly like to
Nice.
run. Yes.
Now, do you run like a regular game, or are you mostly are you a hired game master at this time mostly, or
sometimes people hire me to run games. Sometimes I just run games for my friends. I ran a regular campaign last year, lasted about 6 or 7 months. It was a mini campaign. And in the fall, this is a fun story. The person who put us together, William, in the fall, I will actually be running hopefully two, at least one pastoral training using Dungeons and Dragons.
wow.
So, and his conference is going to hire me. So I will be paid to run a game for about 5 clergy people to teach them to use Dungeons and Dragons to talk about inclusion and justice issues in the life of the church. It's amazing.
Whatever works.
I love it.
Whatever works, man. And sometimes those, like, having things like that incorporated as a game helps people learn. You know, part of the reason that I probably avoided D&D for most of my life is I'm a abysmal reader. I have such bad attention span. I can't read. I see a page filled with words and my eyes roll behind my head. So I listened and I watched. And now in this age when I can listen to podcasts and watch people play and look up YouTube videos and then learning as I go is how I learn. So if I had an issue and I was trying to work out my issues, I feel like making it some sort of a game or interactive experience. I'm not going to read a self-help book. It's not going to help me. You know, if I was an alcoholic and I was trying to read a book on not drinking, I would want to drink. That's what, you know what I mean?
It's funny you mentioned this because I had this discussion with someone online. It was another older gamer like myself. And they were talking about these kids today don't read the D&D books like we did back in the day. And I said, hold on a second there, buddy. Uh-huh. I said, I was an avid reader. I read the books through and through, but the other people playing did not.
Right.
They only read the books for the characters they wanted to run.
Yep.
So what you're remembering, I asked him, I said, let me guess, you ran most of the games for your group, didn't you?
Right.
He said, well, yeah. I said, that's because the dungeon master always had to know as many of the rules as possible.
Right.
And it even said that in the rule books back in the day. It said this book is for the dungeon master only.
Right.
So the players were not expected to read all the books or know all the rules. And they were supposed to pick them up and learn them as they went along. It was just the dungeon master. And you know, you talk about having trouble reading. I actually have that trouble now. I'm on new medication to help me concentrate better. So I'm doing what you're doing now. You know, 5th edition, I learned how to play 5e, one, because I'd already played previous editions.
Right.
But I also learned how to play 5e from just jumping in and playing as a player.
Yeah.
And because that is the best way to learn. My wife's an educator. She'll tell you that the best way to learn is through participation.
I can run games now. I didn't read any of the books, and your friend would hate me probably a lot, or whoever you spoke with.
I actually, on the internet, changed his mind.
Okay.
I have done that 3 times in my life.
And that's fine.
I've changed someone's mind on the internet. Yeah. That's called the Holy Trinity of Miracles
the internet world. It's very difficult to do. Yes. But, I mean, I've spoken with so many different people that have played tabletop games, and I've spoken to the person who didn't read the books at all, just homebrewed everything off the whim, and then I've spoken to people younger than me that like, no, I read the book cover to cover twice. What are you talking about? And I'm like, everyone's different, so you can't judge. But how about your games? What are some fun? What's going on in your games? What's been fun? Previous games. Let's get some fun stories.
All right, I'm going to give you, when you asked me to tell a fun story, this is one of the fun stories I'm going to tell you. This was a number of years ago. This was playing 3rd edition. The rules in 3rd edition have a lot of similarities to 5e.
Sure.
So these players were on an island, and there was a slod, this evil kind of creature, at the top of a tower as they're running away from the tower, shooting at them with this gem in his hands, right? Now, the whole point was I wanted them to run away. This creature is too powerful for these 2nd level characters to take on. You should not take on this slod with this gem. And like most D&D players, they said, screw you, DM. We're going to try and take it out. So the rogue starts climbing up the side of the building using spider climb, so he doesn't have to roll any checks. Mm-hmm. He's just climbing and going to try and sneak attack it. The cleric is on the ground, and he says, played by my brother-in-law, by the way, and he says, I want to cast Shatter on that gem. Now, the thing is, Shatter does not work. A low-level Shatter spell would not work on a magical gem. And I could have just said, hey, I'm just going to let it dissipate. It didn't work, right? And get them out of there. But I'm the type of DM, I always want to give them a chance. Mm-hmm. And I said, you roll me a nat 20, and it works. Guess what he rolled?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And so the gem explodes. Now, this is a magical gem exploding. Now, I can't remember if 3rd edition had rules for explosions of magical items at that time. So I pulled out my old 1st edition Dungeon Master's book and looked up to see what in 1st edition that would have done. The damage was enough to blow up the freaking tower.
Right.
With the rogue on the side of the tower.
Oh, no.
Now, I don't want to insta-kill the rogue.
Right.
Because, that's going to be mean too, and he's going to be mad at the other player. So I said to him, okay, Robert. And his name was Robert. I said, Robert, if your rogue can hold on to the side of the building that's going out like Spider-Man.
Right. Yeah.
Because you got spider climb going on. If you can make me a check that you're holding onto the side of the building, we'll go from there. And I set his check up pretty high. He rolls the check. He makes it.
Okay.
I said, yeah, but that piece of stone is coming away from the building. You're going to hit the ground. You're going to take X amount falling damage, crushing damage, bludgeoning damage. He said, here's what I want to do. Since you said Spider-Man, Derek, I'm going to start trying to jump from stone to stone to stone till I can get to the ground.
That's
dope. I said, here's what's going to happen. You're going to have to give me a dexterity check. I was using dexterity checks, which you could do in 5e. You couldn't do in 3rd edition.
I can envision how this would play out. Yeah.
Yeah. So I said, I'm going to give you dexterity checks to jump from stone to stone to stone that are going to get increasingly difficult. After he rolled 3 17s and 18s in a row, I said, you're using different dice. 19, and on his last roll, a natural 20.
Wow.
He's running a halfling rogue. Says, oh, and by the way, since I rolled a natural 20, I'm doing a triple somersault in the air, landing and going, ta-da!
Ta-da! That's beautiful.
And I'm just like, you guys, we are not playing next week because you just screwed up my adventure, and I have to really rethink what I'm going to do.
Yeah, because I'm guessing that
they have this whole tower with all this magical stuff at 2nd level that they can raid, because the magical stuff wasn't at the top of the tower where the slide was.
Right.
It was all down there. So they were able to raid the tower and get all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, they just get the whole... That's like getting all the loot from the dungeon without having to actually fight the dungeon. Amazing. It's
They
amazing.
teleported past the boss. That's what they did. They teleported past the boss.
That's amazing. That's so lucky that, I mean, it's good that you give that option for like, yeah, sure, you can try. You can certainly try, is the thing.
Oh, that's the most beautiful and evil thing a dungeon master could say.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you can try that.
Yeah.
Now, one of my cruelest moments.
Okay, yeah, let's go the other direction.
One of my cruelest moments on the other side. This was 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons. This is the mid-90s. I still remember this. They were fighting this dragon. And they were all running high-level characters. They had magic out the wazoo. And they're like, we can stomp through this and we can take down these dragons and we're going to go fight Tiamat. So they're fighting one of Tiamat's guardian dragons. And they kill it. And the guy who kills it is playing a paladin in full plate. He's down to 5 hit points. And as it dies, he said, you know what? I bet Derek's going to be an ass. Pardon me if I can't say ass. But I think Derek's going to be an ass and let this dragon fall on me. I didn't even think of it till he said that. And I said, how did you know? I'll let you roll your own damage. And his paladin was flattened. His paladin in plate mail was flattened into a tuna can.
Oh, no.
By all the damage he rolled, as I believe it was not a silver dragon, a frost dragon.
Oof.
A fully grown adult frost dragon fell on top of him.
Oh my gosh. Smush.
Crushed him. And so that was one of my crueler moments there.
Careful what you wish for. Don't manifest those. Don't put those ideas in the DM's head. It's dangerous. Yeah. What about you?
And the best part was I went, how did you know I was going to do that?
Yeah. Great idea. Good job. Yeah. I want to get one more of you as a player. Let's get one. What do you tend to go for as a player? Do you
Well, back, no surprise here, but back in the early days of my Dungeons & Dragons in the 80s, I guess I always had some sort of religious bent because I liked to play clerics and druids.
Okay.
The most fun I had was this over a year-long campaign I got into when COVID began. I played a bard. I really had fun playing the bard. And my DM was such a great guy because I couldn't make it to some games. And so for that would be when I had downtime and my bard was out touring. So my bard, I cannot sing a lick, but my bard would have his own T-shirts made up,
Right.
It's like, it was great. So I'd run a bard. The latest thing I've ran, and I had a lot of fun with it, I never ran a monk in any other edition of Dungeons & Dragons. I just never had any desire to ever run a monk.
Okay.
But in 3rd edition, in 5th edition, I've run my first monk, and it's a tabaxi monk, the equivalent of a tabaxi monk. And it was a lot of fun. In the last game I was able to play in with them, my monk was able to do a somersault onto the back of a basilisk.
Oh, nice.
And blind it from behind so he could so it would stop turning our people to stone.
Right.
We should have run away from that one, but we didn't run away either. And that was a lot of fun that we did that and had fun with that. So yeah, that was something I did. And then in this other game I'm playing in, I'm running a wizard necromancer. Ooh. A good aligned necromancer. So he's a good guy.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to raise, he only raises, I put in his backstory, I only raise dead from people I only turn you into a zombie or a skeleton if you've attacked me, or if you gave me permission to use your body after you died.
That makes sense. I know. donate your body to the necromancer. They should put that on on your license instead of an organ donor.
That's not a bad idea. I may put that in a game where, would you like to, when you meet the necromancer, the necromancer hires you for an adventure, and when you're signing the adventure contract, it has a checkbox. Would you like to donate your body to necromantic studies? Your family will be greatly compensated.
It puts the do not resuscitate to a whole new level.
That would be fun.
Do not revivify. Do not raise dead. Yeah, that's the signal. That's funny.
Yeah.
Excellent, man.
Yeah.
All right. Before we kind of wrap this up, is there anything else you kind of want to share before we get you out of here?
Well, if people want to find me on social media, you can pretty much find me through just Googling the Geek Preacher. You can find me on Instagram, the Geek Preacher, on TikTok, the Geek Preacher, on Twitter at Geek Preacher. I have a Facebook page, the Geek Preacher. So if you'd like to find me at any of those places, you feel free to do so. And hopefully we will have our documentary, The Satanic Panic and the Religious Battle for the Imagination, coming out sometime soon here in the U.S. We also, if you're interested in faith and imagination, the two other documentaries I've done, one is available now on YouTube for free with ads called The Fantasy Makers, and the other can be streamed on Tubi TV for free called The Science Fiction Makers.
Wow, thank you. And I have your link tree, so I'll drop a bunch I'll drop that in the description when this episode releases. Hey, shout out to D Mattingly for hanging out, and looks like we got someone else, Fight029. Thanks for checking out the show. If anyone have just been hopping on, this is You Had to Be There, a D&D storytelling podcast. My name's Tom DeSillis. I host the show. Pretty much we tend to sit down with different tabletop role-playing game enthusiasts. We talk about fun stories or cool projects that they're doing, and then we laugh a lot, and it's a good time. If you want to be a guest on the show, you can always hit me up on Twitter at TDeSillisComedy, or you can shoot me an email at youhadtobethere@gmail.com. The show releases every other Wednesday, and we go live on Twitch here. You Had to Be There podcast, pretty much whenever it's convenient for my guest and I. Always got to mention that my music for my intro was created by Michael James McGarry. You can follow him on It's MJ Made on Instagram and SoundCloud. And my logo was created by Nicole Summers from the Reliably Chaotic Podcast. We got Haven RPG hopped on right at the end. Favorite topic, necromancy. We'll have to talk about that next time, my friend. Thanks again for listening, everyone. This has been You Had to Be There with Reverend Derek White. Bye, everyone.